numeration, or mark as it would be called for us. This is L. They go through the letters. Now this particular model, Panzer III, is quite late in the production run. It's got a 5cm gun on it, so 50mm long-barreled anti-tank gun on it. It's got extra armour bolted on the front. Now for the Germans, they in the 1930s, when Hitler comes to power in 1933, he basically rips up the Versailles Peace Treaty. The Germans have already secretly been working with the war, returned to Britain so we could work out what's the best way of trying to defeat them. Now this Panzer III's got some original battle damage still on it. We're not too sure exactly where it was captured, but we do know the unit, and it's been one of those vehicles that's always been a bit of a runner here for most of its history at the museum. You'll see photographs of this running around in a grey colour back from the 1960s. So there it is as a complement, two vehicles, Tiger I and the Panzer III, two running bits of German armour, but also a really good contrast between how far that Tiger, look at the difference in scale. Now, if you're out in the arena a bit earlier on, you would have seen this vehicle. Stuart was talking about it. Again, trying to put vehicles in context. This is what Japan did for a tank back in the early 1930s. Goes into production in mid-30s, actually keep making them pretty much to the end of the war. This is the Type 95, or the Hargo, the third model, basically, of tank they built. Now this is, again, this Japanese tank designer, Tomio Hara, the Stuart light tank that goes into service early in 1941. Just do experimentation. So when war comes, they are ready to then throw money at the problem, and they've got prototype systems such as the suspension, such as using the radial aeroplane engine in the back of this vehicle and that 37mm gun. So they put these together in a hurry. We call it officially, Churchill likes the idea, instead of all these abbreviations all the time that we forget which one's which, M3A, whatever it is, Churchill says, give me names. So they call American vehicles after American generals. But at the same time, if you can make that vehicle work, it's great for the British. Where you are, what your enemy is, and what they believe is going to be the best way of using this vehicle. It sees service right to the end of the war. A newer model comes out called the M5 version. This is the M3. They didn't do an M4 because they knew everyone would get confused. The M4 is, in everyone's mind's eye, the Sherman. So they jumped to the M5 as the next model. Started off by going to America before they're in the war saying, can you build tanks for us? And that leads on to the fact that afterwards we end up saying, no, we'll buy into the tanks you're going to make because that makes it simpler. Now after the Grant tank, we then move on very quickly. The Grant basically is an interim vehicle. It has got a howitzer in the hull. The Americans haven't quite got to the point of being able to put a fully 360 turret into production yet that will take a sizable gun, such as a 75mm. Now, as you'll be aware, this particular Sherman, if you look at every Sherman, there's lots of differences. This particular type of Sherman, the 75mm gun Sherman, come on in a moment, you'll notice the fact that it's a shorter barreled gun and it's what they call medium velocity. This is a higher velocity gun with the aim that it can send the rounds out with much more force behind them. Now this particular tank, this model with the twin diesels, tended to be given to the Russians. It was given to Britain as well. It wasn't used by the American forces in the field, even though, as you can see, this is the tank that was used in the Fury movie. Little bit of license there, but we've kept all the bits and pieces. It's got that HVSS, the later model suspension on it, and it was the tank that was a hero tank with Brad Pitt in the top and a couple of our guys 6 months on a film set just north of London. And of course it fought against Tiger 131. It was our Tiger in the film as well, that went off site for a couple of weeks and was used as the enemy Tiger tank, doing whatever silly things it did in the movie, like manoeuvring from a position that was perfectly safe for a Tiger. What you would not be taught to do as a Tiger commander, you just sit there and wait for the enemy to come to you, pick them off with your superior firepower and your range, keep your thick armour facing towards the enemy. What you don't do is move and expose your thinner rear end or your side armour to the enemy, which is exactly what happens in the film. So it's one of the ways you can understand, or you can identify, that this has got the multi-bank in it. It ends up with having the suspension slightly further apart, and that means its ground pressure, funnily enough, because it's got longer tracks, it's the one that's got the least ground pressure of all the Sherman tanks. So this would be called an M4A4, really helps the soldier. Of course, they'd all have thicker armour, they'd all have bigger guns, but the Americans, quite rightly, are sticking to a tank of 30 tons. And Britain uses some of these lighter tanks before the end of the conflict. Now it's called the Chaffee by the British, still going again. They're American generals. Chaffee was the guy who helped get the American armoured force together in the late 1930s. He dies of cancer before the war begins, but his product, as it were, his idea of how the Americans should fight goes on into the war, so they honour him by naming the tank after him. And with this vehicle, you've ended up with about a 25-ton vehicle, or they didn't want to go beyond 25 ton, which is why they stopped the T-72 vehicle. But this fellow, we end up with about 4,000 of these are made, and the key one with the Chaffee is it's got a really impressive speed to it. So here comes our Chaffee, sorry about that, talking all about it, and it hasn't started running around yet, but there it goes. Cadillac build it, so does a company called Massey Harris. Cadillac are the design authorities, but they come up with a new engine in the back that they've also been putting in the later model. That's speedy for a vehicle like this. This one's just been restored, so it's in lovely order, and it's painted as a British Chaffee. It's being used at the end of the war, and I've got an account here. Some of you may know there's a book called Troop Leader by Bill Bellamy, and Bellamy was given a Chaffee, just a very thin 25mm armour. You've got a good gun on it. They put a 75mm gun. It's a gun that was originally developed from one that, of all things, was put on a B-25 Mitchell bomber. It was for ground attack. They develop it further. It's got relatively low pressure. In other words, the rounds don't come out with enormous amount of force behind them. But at 75mm, the round that comes out the end of the barrel is exactly the same size as the 17-pounder round, but it's got a different projectile case. They use the brass case from the 3-inch anti-aircraft gun. So even quite often people call this like a short 17-pounder. Actually, it's a very different gun entirely. But it is a high velocity gun, and Britain has now come up with discarding sabot ammunition. So what's that mean? It's the idea that you fire a slug of tungsten surrounded by a pot out the end of the barrel with enormous kinetic energy behind it, the pop falls away, and that slug of tungsten flies towards the enemy at supersonic speed. He escapes to Britain in 1940, works with a guy called Kopop. That ammunition that they come up with is a world beater. It really does improve the firepower of these guns. Now the Comet tank is also, it's for the first time now, just like it's in the Cromwell, we've got powerful engines. Years ago, there was some in Burma into service well in the 1980s. Now, the tank that's coming on now with its turret reverse, the guns in its travel lock there, this is the tank we made right at the end of the war, doesn't see service, the famous Centurion tank, the A41. What happens with the Centurion, it starts off, you can see that front bit now, we don't have a machine gun put on the glacé plates, so they've got rid of that lovely step. That moves on at the end of the 1950s to a 105mm gun. It's got that Meteor engine in the back. Now the one downside of the Meteor is very thirsty, so the range of the tanks, the Centurion tank when they first go into service is not that great. They actually build later models with extra tanks on the rear. The Second World War, using that British L7 105mm gun. Now a 9 diesel engine in the back, give that vehicle power. So you can see there and hear they move on to the T-72 and then the T-64. This one coming on now is a T-72 tank. And there would be so many of them that they'd be following up. Once the first wave has gone through, another wave would take over. So the idea of the T-72, it's that Russian philosophy, keep it simple. It's got a diesel engine in the back, very similar to the one that was in the T-34 in the Second World War protection. We wanted a very powerful gun on our tanks to outrange the enemy, and we were less worried about mobility because we were going to be a defending army. We didn't have to race to capture bridges or to get across to the Rhine or Niederrhein, and therefore this tank, the Chieftain, ended up with some of the thickest armour protection of any tank in that post-war period. The Chieftain was fitted with 120mm, about 13 inches long, made of tungsten or depleted uranium. They go through the air, they've got no explosive on at all. They are there to penetrate enemy armour. Completely ignored that. For some reason in Britain we went along with it and tried to design a big engine that could take petrol, diesel, aviation fuel, bottle of vodka, whatever you had, and it never quite worked. Will we decide to actually convert more of them, not less? they will still undoubtedly have a role on the battlefield.
Yay, over the bridge.
Now this is an American Cold War tank, the M60.
Oh, I missed that.
Casting, almost a mini turret on top of that with a 50 caliber machine gun for the commander and a steel hull with a rocket range diesel engine in the back. Looks in its bare armour form. The Israelis added reactive armour, those blocks of armour to explode when they're hit. Blazer, it was called by the Israelis, and that takes the pressure of an incoming round or a hollow charge round away from the vehicle. So, ladies and gentlemen, that pretty much, once the tanks are off, ends our live display this afternoon. A lot of the guys driving the vehicles who've helped put them together, they're volunteers. They give their spare time to do this, so do give them a round of applause. They've done very well to keep these all going. Thank you.